The first thing they taught her was how to hold a knife. She was 8 years old. The knife was too large for her hand, a short-bladed thing with a leather grip worn smooth by someone else's palm. And the man who placed it there did not tell her his name or ask hers. He closed her fingers around the handle, adjusted her thumb, and said, "Again." She did not know what again meant. She had not done anything yet, but she learned over the next 15 years that again was the only word that mattered in the Ashenmoor compound. Again meant do it until your muscles tear. Again meant stand up after the blow. Again meant you are not finished because I have not told you that you are finished, and I will never tell you that you are finished because a weapon does not get to be finished. Isolde. That was her name, though no one used it. In the compound, she was called the Blade, or the Girl, or nothing at all. Corvus Ashenmoor be. The man who owned her, though he would have said trained, though he would have said made, called her his finest work. He said this the way a blacksmith says it about a sword, with pride in the craft and no regard for the metal. She did not remember her parents. She had been told once by Dagna, the older woman who trained her in close combat, who broke her nose the first time when she was 10, and said it herself afterward with hands that were rough and quick and not unkind, that her mother had been an Omega in a border pack that Corvus had dissolved. The word dissolved was precise. It meant destroyed. It meant the adults were killed or scattered, and the children were sorted, and the ones who showed promise were kept, and the ones who did not were sent to work camps in the eastern mountains. Isolde had shown promise. She was fast. She was quiet. She could hold still for longer than any child Dagna had ever seen. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of something waiting, something that had already calculated the distance and the angle and was simply choosing when. By 12, she could disarm a grown man. By 15, she could kill one. By 18, she had, and the first time was in a border skirmish that Corvus had engineered to test her. And that man she killed was someone's father. And she knew this because she heard someone scream the word from across the field. And the sound of it went into her chest and stayed there like a splinter that she could not reach. She did not cry. She had stopped crying at 9 when Corvus explained to her, calmly, precisely, in the quiet, measured voice he used for all his instructions, that tears were a malfunction. Weapons do not malfunction, he said. Weapons perform, and you, little Blade, will perform. She performed 15 years. She performed for 15 years, and in that time she became the thing they made her, fast and silent and lethal, a lean, hard creature who moved through rooms like smoke and could put a knife through a throat at 30 paces and could sit in a cell with a stone floor and no window and feel nothing about it because feeling was a malfunction and she did not malfunction. She was 23 years old. She had pale white skin that had not seen enough sunlight, and ice blonde hair cropped short the skull because long hair gets grabbed in a fight, and cold pale gray eyes that did not blink as often as other people's eyes blinked. She had a thin scar from her right temple down through her eyebrow, a training wound from when she was 14, Dagna's blade moving a fraction too fast. She had a sharp jaw and high cheekbones and a mouth that had forgotten what smiling felt like, and hands that knew 37 ways to kill a man and 0 ways to touch one gently. People flinched when she entered a room. She had noticed this early. The way bodies shifted away from her, the way eyes dropped, the way conversations paused and then resumed at a slightly different pitch. She moved wrong. She was too still when she was still, and too fast when she moved, and there was something in her pale gray eyes that made people's wolves flatten their ears and press their bellies to the ground. She was a weapon. Weapons do not need people to be comfortable around them. Weapons need people to be afraid. Corvus called her to his study on a night in late autumn. The study was a cold stone room at the top of the Ashenmoor keep, lit by a single lamp that threw his shadow long against the wall. He was 55 years old, lean and gray and precise, with the patience of a man who had been building something for a very long time and was now ready to use it. "The Alpha King," Corvus said, "is holding a winter summit at Iron Vale. The northern packs will attend. There will be a feast, a council, and a night when the king sleeps behind a single bolted door with 4 guards in the corridor." He did not say the rest. He did not need to. Isolde stood in the doorway of his study, with her hands at her sides and her gray eyes on his face, and she understood. "The bolt will not stop you," Corvus said. "The guards will not stop you. You will enter the chamber, you will complete the task, and you will leave by the eastern window. Dagna will have a horse waiting at the tree line." "And after?" Isolde asked. Her voice was flat. It was always flat. Inflection was a malfunction. "After, the northern territories will have no king, and the vacuum will be filled by someone who understands that strength is not governance and mercy is not policy." He smiled. It was a thin smile, calculated, the kind of smile that was really a display of teeth. "The summit is in 3 weeks. You will travel with the Ashenmoor delegation as a household guard. You will not speak. You will not draw attention. You will wait until the 3rd night, and then you will do what I made you to do." Isolde nodded. She did not ask why. She had never asked why. Why was a malfunction. She left the study and walked the cold stone corridor to her cell. The cell was 6 paces by 4, with a stone floor and a narrow cot and a single high window that let in a strip of gray sky. The door locked from the outside. It had always locked from the outside. She had never considered that doors could lock any other way. She lay on the cot and stared at the strip of sky and thought about the Alpha King she was meant to kill. She knew his name, Bramwell Ironvale, and his reputation. He was said to be steady, patient, the kind of Alpha who read the old laws and followed them, who settled disputes with words before force, who had held the northern territories together through 3 border conflicts without a single village burned. He was said to be large and quiet and impossible to provoke. She thought about putting a knife in his throat. She thought about the angle, low, upward beneath the jaw into the brainstem. Quick! He would not suffer. This mattered to her, though she could not have explained why, because mattering was a malfunction. She closed her eyes. The strip of sky went dark. She slept the way she always slept, lightly, with one hand near the blade beneath her pillow and her heartbeat steady and slow, the heartbeat of a thing that did not dream. The journey to Iron Vale took 6 days. Isolde rode with the Ashenmoor delegation, 12 wolves in dark travel cloaks, mounted on dark horses, moving through the late autumn landscape in a column that did not speak. Corvus rode at the front. Dagna rode beside Isolde, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. Dagna was 53 years old, iron gray hair cropped close, a face that was all angles and old scars, and the particular weariness of a woman who had spent 30 years doing things she could not undo. She had trained Isolde from the beginning. The knife work, the close combat, the silent movement, the art of entering a room without being seen and leaving it without being heard. She had also set Isolde's broken nose and stitched the cut above her eye, and once, when Isolde was 11 and shaking with fever in the cell, had sat beside her through the night with a cold cloth on her forehead and said nothing because there was nothing to say. On the 3rd day of riding, Dagna spoke. "The king," she said, her voice low enough that only Isolde could hear. He is not what Corvus says. Isolde did not respond. She had learned that silence was safer than speech, and that Dagna's moments of disclosure were rare and fragile and best received without interruption. I met him once, Dagna continued. 7 years ago at the Border Council. He sat through 8 hours of negotiation without raising his voice. A man threw a goblet at his head. He caught it, set it down, continued speaking. She was quiet for a moment. He did not flinch. Isolde filed this information in the place where she kept tactical data, alongside room dimensions and guard rotations and the weight of a thrown blade at various distances. The king did not flinch. This was relevant. A man who flinched was easier to kill than a man who did not. You do not have to do this, Dagna said. This was dangerous. This was the most dangerous thing Dagna had ever said, and Isolde understood the weight of it. The years of loyalty to Corvus balanced against whatever it was that Dagna felt for the girl she had raised and broken and stitched back together. I am a weapon, Isolde said. Weapons do not choose. Dagna said nothing else. They rode on through the gray autumn afternoon, and the trees thinned, and the road climbed, and on the 6th day, they crested the final ridge and saw Iron Vale below. It was not what she expected. She had been raised in the Ashenmoor compound, a fortress of dark stone built into the side of a mountain, windowless and cold, designed for function rather than beauty. Iron Vale was different. It sat in a wide valley between 2 mountain ridges, and it was built of pale gray stone that caught the late afternoon light and held it, glowing faintly golden against the dark pine forests that surrounded it. There were windows, many windows, tall and wide, with glass that reflected the sky. There were gardens even in late autumn. She could see the brown stalks of harvested beds and the dark earth turned for winter. There was smoke rising from chimneys, and the sound of dogs barking, and the distant shout of children playing in a courtyard. Children playing. She could not remember the last time she had heard that sound. She could not remember if she had ever made it. They entered through the main gate. The guards were courteous, not tense, not hostile, just courteous, the way guards are when they serve a lord who does not rule by fear. They checked the delegation seals, nodded, and waved them through. No weapons were confiscated. No threats were made. Corvus dismounted in the courtyard with the practiced ease of a man who owned every space he entered. Isolde dismounted behind him, silent, her eyes moving across the courtyard with the automatic precision of someone cataloging exits. 3! The main gate behind them, a smaller gate to the east leading to what appeared to be stables, and a postern door in the south wall half hidden by a climbing vine. The eastern window of the king's chamber. She would need to locate it. 3rd night, the angle of approach, the position of the guards, the distance from the window to the bed. She was cataloging all of this when she felt it. A presence, heavy, warm, steady, like standing near a banked fire, the kind that has been burning for hours and will burn for hours more. She turned her head, a fractional movement, controlled, the turn of a predator identifying a new element in the terrain, and she saw him. Bramwell Ironvale stood in the doorway of the great hall. He was tall, taller than Corvus, taller than the guards flanking him, taller than anyone she had measured in recent memory. 6'4", broad-shouldered, with the heavy muscle of a man who worked alongside his people rather than above them. His dark brown hair was cut short and threaded with early gray at the temples, and his face was strong and square and weathered, with deep-set, dark hazel eyes that caught the failing light and held it. A crooked nose that had been broken in youth and never properly reset, and a short, dark beard trimmed close to the jaw. He was looking at her, not at Corvus, not at the delegation, at her, his dark hazel eyes She could see the rings of warm amber around the pupils, even from 20 paces, were on her face, steady and calm and absolutely unflinching. Everyone flinched when they looked at her. Everyone. The guards at the gate had shifted their weight when she passed. The stable hand who took her horse had dropped his eyes. Even Corvus, who had made her, who had owned her for 15 years, looked at her sometimes with the careful attention of a man watching a blade he was not entirely certain he controlled. The Alpha King did not flinch. He looked at her the way you look at a person, not a weapon, not a threat, not a creature that made wolves flatten their ears, a person, and something in his steady, unhurried gaze, the warmth of it, the calm, the absolute refusal to be afraid, hit her in the chest like a fist. And for the first time in 14 years, Isolde felt something malfunction. It was small, a crack, hairline thin, in the cold, smooth surface she had built around herself. She sealed it immediately. Years of training, years of discipline, the automatic response of a weapon that detects a flaw and corrects it. But the crack had been there. She had felt it. And the king had seen her feel it, she was certain, because his eyes stayed on hers for a moment longer than necessary. And then he looked away and greeted Corvus with the measured courtesy of a man who trusted no one at his table but fed them anyway. The summit began. 3 days. She had 3 days to map the hold, locate the king's chamber, identify the guard rotation, and plan the approach. She did this with the efficiency of long practice, moving through Iron Vale in her dark cloak with her silent step, cataloging everything. The hold was well built, but not fortress tight. The king's chamber was on the second floor of the eastern wing, accessible by a main staircase and a servant's stair. The eastern window overlooked a small courtyard with a garden wall, climbable. The guards rotated every 4 hours, 2 at the main stair, 2 at the chamber door. The bolt on the door was heavy iron, but standard make. She could defeat it in under 30 seconds with the picks she carried sewn into the lining of her left boot. She had her plan by the end of the first day. The second and third days were observation, confirming the patterns, checking for variables, ensuring that nothing would interrupt the approach. But something was interrupting. Something she had not planned for, and could not catalog, and could not file in the tactical space where she kept room dimensions and guard rotations. The king kept looking at her, not watching. She knew what being watched felt like, and this was not it. Corvus watched her the way a handler watches a hound. The guards at Ashenmoor watched her the way prey watches a predator. The Alpha King looked at her the way. She did not have a comparison. She had no frame of reference for the thing his eyes did when they found her across a room. At the first evening's feast, she stood against the wall behind the Ashenmoor delegation, silent and still in her dark cloak, and she felt his gaze find her from the high table. She did not look up. She catalogued it as data. The king is aware of my position, and filed it. At the second day's council, she stood in the rear of the hall, and the king's eyes found her again during a pause in the negotiations. This time she looked back. His dark hazel eyes met her pale gray ones across the length of the hall, and he did not drop his gaze, and he did not shift his weight, and he did not flinch. She looked away first. This had never happened before. She had never been the one to look away first. On the third day, the last day, the day before the night, she was in the eastern courtyard at dawn, checking the garden wall, measuring the distance from the wall to the window with her eyes, when she heard a voice behind her. "You move like someone who has been trained to move." She turned. The king was standing 10 paces behind her, alone, without guards, without weapons visible, wearing a plain, dark wool coat and heavy boots, as though he had come from the stables. His dark hazel eyes, with their rings of warm amber, were on her face, and his expression was, she did not know. She did not have a word for it. It was not fear, it was not suspicion. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either. Most people who move the way you move, he continued, are either soldiers or something else entirely. "I am a household guard," Isolde said. Her voice was flat. Inflection was a malfunction. "No," he said. You are not. Silence. The dawn air was cold and still. Somewhere in the hold, a door opened and closed. A bird called from the garden wall. I have been watching you, the king said. Not because you are a threat, though you are, and we both know it, but because you're the saddest person I have ever seen. The hairline crack in the cold, smooth surface. It opened again, wider this time, and she felt something move behind it, something hot and formless that she did not recognize because she had not felt it since she was 8 years old. Sad, she repeated. The word tasted foreign in her mouth. Sad, he said. The way a blade is sad. Not because it cuts, but because it was never given the choice. She should have killed him then. He was 10 paces away, alone, unarmed. She could have closed the distance in under 2 seconds. She could have ended it and climbed the wall and been gone before the guards found him. Instead, she stood in the garden in the gray dawn and looked at the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and he looked back, and neither of them flinched. I know what you are here to do, he said quietly. I have known since you arrived. The air left her lungs. Not a gasp. She did not gasp, but a slow, controlled exhale, the exhale of a weapon recalibrating after an unexpected variable. How? She asked. Because Corvus Ashenmoor has been trying to kill me for 6 years, and you are the most dangerous thing he has ever pointed at anyone, and he brought you to my home and put you in my halls and waited for the 3rd night. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that had sat through 8 hours of negotiation without rising. I am not a fool, Isolde. Her name. He had used her name. Not the blade, not the girl, not the household guard. Her name, and the sound of it in his voice, low, warm, heavy with something she could not identify, went through her like a blade of a different kind. You know my name, she said. I know everything about you. I know Corvus took you from the border pack when you were 8. I know Dagna trained you. I know you have killed for him, and I know you did not choose to. His eyes had not left hers. And I know you are standing in my garden at dawn instead of climbing through my window, which tells me something that I suspect Corvus does not know. What does it tell you? That the weapon he built has a crack in it, and the crack is not a flaw. It is the place where the person is still alive. She could not breathe. She could not breathe, and this was a malfunction, and she could not correct it, because the king was standing 10 paces away and looking at her with eyes that did not flinch, and a voice that said her name, like it belonged to someone who mattered. And the thing behind the crack in her surface was pushing outward now, hot and formless and enormous, and she did not know what it was because no one had ever taught her the word for it. What do you want? She whispered. The whisper was a malfunction. She did not whisper. I want you to put the knife down, he said. Not because I am ordering you, not because I am stronger than you. I am, but that is not the point. I want you to put the knife down because I am asking you, as one person to another, to choose something different from what Corvus made you for. Her hand was on the blade at her hip. She had not realized. The grip was instinctive, the weapon reaching for itself, the muscle memory of 15 years. She looked down at her own hand as though it belonged to someone else. I do not know how to put it down, she said. And she meant the knife, and she meant everything, the training, the killing, the cold, smooth surface, the cell with the door that locked from the outside, the 15 years of again and again and again. I know, he said. That is why I am asking, not telling. He extended his hand. Open, palm up, empty. The hand of a man who had decided to trust a weapon with his life. She looked at his hand. She looked at the knife at her hip. She looked at the garden wall, the eastern window, the dawn sky going pale above the mountains. She let go of the knife. It was not dramatic. Her fingers opened. Her hand fell to her side. The blade stayed in its sheath, and the king's extended hand stayed where it was, open, patient, waiting. She did not take it. She was not ready for that. But she let go of the knife, and the king saw her let go, and he nodded. Once, slow, the nod of a man who understood that what she had just done was the hardest thing she had ever done. And he lowered his hand. There is a room, he said, in the western wing. It has a window that faces the garden and a fireplace and a door that bolts from the inside. From the inside, she repeated. Yes, from the inside. No one will enter unless you permit it. Not me, not my guards, not anyone. She stared at him, a door that bolted from the inside. She had never, in 23 years, in all the cells and barracks and cold stone rooms of the Ashenmoor compound, she had never had a door that locked from her side. Why? She asked. Because you are a person, he said, and persons get to choose who comes in. Corvus noticed. She did not return to the Ashenmoor delegation that night. She did not climb the garden wall. She did not enter the king's chamber through the eastern window with a blade in her hand and 15 years of training driving her muscles. Instead, she walked through the halls of Ironvale with the king beside her, not touching, not speaking, just walking. And she followed him to the western wing, and he opened the door to a room that was warmer and larger and more alive than any space she had occupied in her memory. There was a fire in the hearth. There were heavy wool blankets on the bed. There was a window with real glass that looked out over the garden, and through it she could see the wall she had been planning to climb, and beyond it, the mountains going dark against the sky. The bolt, the king said, and he guided her hand to the iron mechanism on the inside of the door. Her fingers found it, heavy, solid, real. She slid it closed. The sound it made was unlike anything she had heard before. It was the sound of a door that she controlled, a door that kept the world out, not her in. The king was on the other side of the door. She could hear his breathing, slow, steady, the breathing of a man who was not afraid to turn his back on a weapon. "Good night, Isolde," he said. She stood with her hand on the bolt and said nothing. After a while, his footsteps retreated down the corridor, and she was alone in a warm room with a fire and a door she had locked herself, and she did not know what to do with any of it. She sat on the bed. The mattress was soft. She had never slept on anything soft. The cot in her cell was a thin pad over stone, designed for utility, not comfort. She touched the blankets. Wool, thick, heavy. She pulled one around her shoulders and felt the weight of it settle against her, warm and encompassing, and nothing like the thin military cloak she slept in at the compound. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the bed with the blanket around her shoulders and listened to the fire and the wind and the distant sounds of a hold that was alive. Voices, footsteps, a dog barking, a door closing. These were the sounds of a place where people lived, not trained. She had never heard them from the inside before. In the morning, there was a knock at the door. 2 steady raps. "Isolde, it is Bramwell. I have brought food. May I come in?" he asked. The way Corvus never asked, the way no one at the compound ever asked because weapons do not get asked, they get told. She unbolted the door. The king stood in the corridor with a wooden tray, bread, butter, a boiled egg, a clay mug of something that steamed. He held it out. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. "Corvus is asking about you," Bramwell said. His voice was the same as it had been in the garden, low, steady, unworried. "He told my steward you were unwell and had been moved to separate quarters." "He is covering," Isolde said. "Yes, he does not know what happened. He only knows that his weapon did not fire." The king leaned against the doorframe. He was large enough that the frame looked small around him. "He will try again. Not tonight. He will wait. He will watch. He will try to get you alone. When he does, he will be angry." "I know what Corvus looks like when he is angry," Isolde said. "I am not concerned about his anger. I am concerned about yours." She looked at him. His dark hazel eyes with their warm amber rings met hers, her cold pale gray, and she saw the same thing she had seen in the garden, the refusal to flinch, the absolute steady willingness to see her as she was, and not look away. "I do not get angry," she said. "Anger is a malfunction." "Who told you that?" "Corvus." "Corvus told you that anger is a malfunction because Corvus is afraid of what you would do if you let yourself feel it." The king's voice was gentle, and the gentleness was more frightening than any command she had ever received, because commands she knew how to obey and gentleness she did not. "You are allowed to be angry, Isolde. You are allowed to feel every single thing he told you was broken." She closed the door. Not in anger. She did not know how to slam a door. had never been in a position to slam one, but in the slow, deliberate way of a person who needed to be alone with something too large to hold in the presence of another. She sat on the bed, she ate the bread, she drank the mug. It was tea, some kind of herbal thing that tasted of mint and chamomile and a sweetness she could not identify. She ate the egg. Then she put her face in her hands, and she felt something move through her that was hot and enormous and had no name, and she shook with it, her whole body shaking, and she did not cry because she had forgotten how, and the shaking was all she had. The days that followed were the strangest of her life. The summit continued. Corvus attended the councils, the feasts, the diplomatic rituals, and Isolde did not. She stayed in the room, in the western wing. She bolted the door. She sat by the fire. She stood at the window and looked at the garden she had planned to use as an escape route, and felt the distance between what she had been sent to do and what she was doing instead. And the distance was an abyss, and the abyss was terrifying, and she stood at its edge and did not jump. Bramwell came every morning. He knocked. He said her name. He asked. She let him in, or she did not. And on the mornings when she did not, when the crack in her surface was too wide and the thing behind it too raw, he left the tray outside the door and walked away without protest. On the mornings when she let him in, he sat in the chair by the fire and talked. Not about the summit, not about Corvus, not about the plan or the knife or the thing she had almost done. He talked about other things. The hold, the valley, the season. He told her about the garden below her window. What had grown there in summer, what would grow again in spring. He told her about the mountains and the passes and the way the snow came down in winter, heavy and quiet, covering everything. He told her about his wolf. He is large, Bramwell said, with the understated delivery of a man describing a mountain as a hill. Dark brown, the color of river mud after rain. His eyes are the same as mine, hazel with the amber ring. He is not fast, he is not flashy, he is steady. Like you, Isolde said, like me, he does not startle, he does not flinch. He does not react to threats with force unless force is the only remaining option, and even then he is precise about it. The king looked at her across the fire. He would like to meet you when you are ready. I have never met a wolf, Isolde said. Corvus did not allow shifting in the compound. He said it was a malfunction, the king said. She looked at him. The word hung in the air between them, and for the first time in her life it sounded wrong. Not correct, not precise, not the clinical terminology of a man managing a weapon. Wrong. The word sounded wrong because the king had said it with a particular emphasis that made her hear it the way it actually was. Not a diagnosis, but a leash. Yes, she said, a malfunction. Your wolf is not a malfunction, Bramwell said. Your wolf is the part of you that Corvus could not reach, the part that is still alive under the training and the discipline and the 15 years of again. Your wolf is the reason you stood in my garden at dawn instead of climbing through my window. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his dark hazel eyes steady. She has been waiting a very long time, Isolde. She is patient. But she is there. Isolde said nothing. She looked at the fire and felt something stir beneath the surface. Deep, deep down, below the training and the discipline in the cold, smooth wall she had built. Something warm and alive and animal that lifted its head at the sound of the king's voice and listened. The summit ended on the 5th day. The delegations began to leave. Corvus did not leave. Isolde heard the confrontation from her room. She was standing at the window, watching the garden, when the sound of raised voices carried through the stone. Not Bramwell's voice, which she had never heard raised, but Corvus's voice, sharp and controlled and edged with the particular fury of a man whose property has been taken from him. She opened the door. She walked through the corridor, down the stairs, through the great hall to the council chamber where the voices were coming from. She moved the way she had always moved, silent, precise, invisible, and no one saw her until she was standing in the doorway. Corvus was facing the king across the council table. His lean gray face was tight with controlled rage. Beside him stood 2 of his wolves. Large men, armed, their hands on their weapons. She is mine, Corvus was saying. She is my ward, raised in my house, trained at my expense. You have no legal right. She is not property, Bramwell said. His voice was low and steady and completely unchanged by the rage across the table. She is an omega of age. She has the right to choose where she lives and with whom. And she has chosen not to return to the Ashenmoor compound. She has not chosen anything. She is incapable of choosing. She does not have the, I chose. Both men turned. Corvus's face went blank. the particular blankness of a man whose weapon has just spoken without authorization. Bramwell's face did not change at all. He looked at her in the doorway with the same steady warmth he had looked at her in the garden, and he waited. "I chose," Isolde said again. Her voice was flat. It was still flat. The inflection had not returned. The 15 years of training did not dissolve in 5 days. But beneath the flatness there was something else, something that had not been there before, an edge that was not the edge of a blade. "You cannot choose," Corvus said. His voice was tight. "You are not capable." "I am capable of putting a knife through your throat from this distance in under 1 second. Her voice had not risen. Her body had not moved. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her pale gray eyes on the man who had made her, and she saw, for the first time, with a clarity that was almost painful, the flinch. Corvus flinched. He flinched, and the 2 armed wolves beside him flinched, and somewhere in the room someone drew a breath, and the only person who did not flinch was the Alpha King, who stood at the other end of the table, with his hands at his sides and his dark hazel eyes on her face and his expression unchanged. "But I will not," Isolde continued. "Not because I cannot, not because I'm ordered not to, because I choose not to. That is the difference, Corvus. That is the thing you never taught me, that the weapon gets to decide whether it fires." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the fire in the hearth across the room. Bramwell spoke. "Your delegation will leave Ironvale by midday, Ashenmoor. Isolde remains here. If you object, you may present your case to the King's Court at the spring session. I suggest you bring better arguments than ownership." Corvus stared at her. She saw it in his eyes. The calculation, the assessment, the cold, precise machinery of a man weighing his options. She saw him consider violence. She saw him consider the 2 armed wolves beside him, and the distance to the king and the distance to her. She saw him calculate the odds and arrive at the same conclusion she would have arrived at. He could not win this fight. "You are making a mistake," Corvus said to Bramwell. But his eyes were on Isolde, and the words were for her. "A weapon that turns on its maker is a weapon that cannot be trusted." "She is not a weapon," Bramwell said. "She never was. You simply never bothered to find out." Corvus left. His wolves followed. The courtyard filled with the sound of horses and departure, and within the hour, the Ashenmoor delegation was gone, and Isolde stood at the window of her room in the western wing and watched them ride out through the gates and down the road and into the distance. And the road was long, and they grew smaller, and the thing she felt watching them go was not loyalty and not regret and not fear. It was relief. And she did not know the word for it, so she simply stood at the window and felt it, formless and warm, and let it be. The weeks that followed were a slow and painful education in being human. Isolde did not know how to live in a room that was hers. She did not know how to sleep in a bed that was soft. She did not know how to eat a meal that was not timed, how to walk through a corridor that was not a route to an objective, how to sit in a chair by a fire without cataloging the exits. She slept on the floor the first week, not the bed. The floor, with her back against the wall and her hand near the blade she had not yet surrendered, because the floor was familiar and the wall at her back was safe and the bed was too soft, and soft was suspicious. Soft was a trap. Soft was a thing that happened before the blow. Bramwell did not comment on this. She suspected he knew. The servants who came to tend the fire and change the linens must have reported the undisturbed bed. But he said nothing. He came every morning. He knocked. He said her name. He asked. And when she let him in, he sat in the chair by the fire and talked. And he did not look at the bed, and he did not look at the floor where the blankets were arranged in a nest against the wall. She began to eat with the household. This was harder than she expected. The great hall at mealtimes was loud and crowded and full of the unstructured chaos of people who were comfortable with each other, and the noise of it, the laughter, the shouting, the clatter of plates and cups, made her skin crawl with the instinctive tension of a creature trained to operate in silence. But she went. She sat at the end of a long table with her back to the wall and her eyes on the room, and she ate, and she did not speak, and the people around her gave her space, not the fearful space of Ashenmoor, the flinching avoidance, but a different kind of space, a respectful distance that said, "We know you need room, and we are giving it to you." Osric, the king's second, was the first person at Ironvale, besides Bramwell, who spoke to her voluntarily. He was a lean man in his 40s, quiet and observant, with close-cropped gray hair and steady blue eyes, and the particular efficiency of movement that marked a career soldier. "You hold your knife wrong," he said, sitting down across from her at breakfast. Isolde looked at the eating knife in her hand. She was holding it in a fighting grip. Blade reversed, edge out, thumb braced along the spine. She had not noticed. 15 years of muscle memory. Not for fighting, Osric clarified. For eating, the blade goes the other way. She turned the knife. It felt wrong in her hand, clumsy, unbalanced, the grip of a tool rather than a weapon. She cut a piece of bread with it, and the bread tore rather than sliced, and the imprecision of it offended her on a level she could not articulate. It gets easier, Osric said. He was eating his own breakfast with the unhurried ease of a man who had never had to relearn how to hold a fork. Most things do. You do not flinch either, Isolde observed. I have served the king for 12 years. I have stopped being surprised by the people he brings home. He said it lightly, but the word home landed in her chest with an unexpected weight, and she looked down at her bread, and her wrongly held knife, and the table full of people who were not afraid of her, and she felt the crack widen by another fraction. Bramwell showed her the garden. It was the same garden she had surveyed from the eastern courtyard, the one with the wall she had planned to climb. In winter it was bare, dark earth and dead stalks and the skeletal frames of trellises stripped of their summer green. But Bramwell walked her through it as though it were in full bloom, pointing at empty beds and naming what would grow there in spring. Rosemary there. It comes back every year. The roots are deep, thyme along the border. The lavender goes here against the south wall where it gets the most sun. He crouched beside an empty bed and touched the dark earth with his bare hand. And here, chamomile. The flowers look like small suns. I do not know what chamomile looks like, Isolde said. He looked up at her, his dark hazel eyes, warm amber rings catching the pale winter light. Then you will see it in spring. It was not a promise. It was an assumption. He assumed she would be here in spring. He assumed the future contained her in it, in this garden, seeing flowers she had never seen. No one had ever assumed Isolde had a future. Weapons do not have futures. Weapons have deployment schedules. I want to see your wolf, she said. He stood. He did not ask if she was sure. He did not warn her. He simply walked to the center of the garden, removed his coat and tunic and boots. She turned her head, not from modesty, but from the instinct of giving him privacy. And she heard the shift. It was not the first time she had heard a shift, but it was the first time she had been permitted to witness one. At Ashenmoor, shifting was forbidden. Corvus kept his wolves in human form, controlled, manageable, because the wolf was the part of a person that could not be trained the way the human could. The sound was raw and visceral, bone cracking and reforming, muscle tearing and reknitting. Then breath, deep, enormous, drawn through a chest that was no longer human. And then the thud of heavy paws on frozen ground. She turned back. He was massive. A dark brown wolf, the color of river mud after rain, with thick, dense fur and heavy, powerful shoulders and a broad head and amber eyes. The same amber-ringed hazel, but deeper now, more gold, glowing with an intelligence that was not quite human and not quite animal, but the place between. He was steady, even in wolf form. The wolf did not lunge, did not approach, did not crowd. He stood in the center of the garden and looked at her with those amber eyes and waited. The way Bramwell waited, patient, unhurried, absolutely sure. She walked toward him. She could feel her heart beating, faster than it should have been, faster than the training permitted. The wolf was enormous. He could have killed her in a single lunge. She cataloged this automatically, the weight, the reach, the power in those massive shoulders, and then she did something she had never done before. She ignored the tactical data. She walked up to the wolf and she put her hand on his head. His fur was thick and warm and softer than she expected. She felt the skull beneath it, broad, heavy, powerful. She felt his ears swivel beneath her palm. She felt his breath, hot and slow, against her wrist. And she felt his pulse, strong and steady, the heartbeat of a creature that was not afraid of her. The wolf lowered his head. He pressed his forehead against her chest, gently, with a weight that was somehow both enormous and careful, and she stood in the frozen garden with her hands in his fur and her chin on the top of his head, and she felt, for the first time in her life, the thing that she would later learn was called safe. She stood there for a long time. The wolf did not move. The garden was quiet. The winter sky was the color of old iron above them. When she finally stepped back, her cheeks were wet. She touched her face and looked at her fingers and did not understand what she was seeing. I am malfunctioning, she said. The wolf exhaled. a long, low sound that was not a growl and not a whine, but something between. She would learn later that it was a wolf's laugh. Winter deepened. The snow came, heavy and steady, covering the valley in white. The hold grew quieter, the sounds softened by the snow. Isolde learned the rhythms of a place that was alive: the morning bell, the breakfast chaos, the afternoon work of a functioning community, the evening meals, the fires banked at night. She learned to sleep in the bed. This took 3 weeks. She moved from the floor to the bed in stages. First sitting on it, then lying on it during the day, then sleeping on it, with the blanket from the floor still wrapped around her like armor. Eventually the blanket armor loosened. Eventually she slept under the heavy wool covers, and the bed was soft, and the softness was not a trap. She learned other things. She learned to hold the eating knife correctly. She learned the names of the people who served meals in the great hall. She learned that the cook kept a honey pot on the 3rd shelf in the kitchen, and that Osric preferred his eggs hard, and that the stable master's dog would sit beside anyone who held still long enough. She learned that she liked tea. This surprised her. She had never liked anything, because liking was a malfunction. But the herbal tea that Bramwell brought every morning, mint and chamomile with honey, was warm and sweet and tasted like nothing she had known at the compound. And she found herself looking forward to it, and the looking forward was itself a revelation. She was learning what looking forward felt like. She was learning what warmth felt like, and routine, and the particular comfort of knowing that the door was bolted from the inside and no one would open it without asking. She had a moment in the kitchen one evening that stayed with her. She had gone to return her tea mug. She always returned it herself because 15 years of compound discipline did not vanish in weeks, and leaving things for others to clean felt wrong in a way she could not articulate. The kitchen was busy. The cook and 3 helpers were preparing the evening meal, and the room was full of steam and the smell of roasting meat and the sharp scent of onions being cut. Isolde stood in the doorway with her mug and waited for a gap in the activity, and the cook, a broad woman with floury hands and a voice that carried, looked up and said, "Oh, set it anywhere, love." Love. The word landed on her like a physical thing, not a weapon word, not a command word. A word that the cook used for everyone she would learn, for the servers and the stable boys, and the king himself when he came looking for bread at midnight. A word that meant nothing and everything. A word that assumed the person it was aimed at was someone who could be loved. Isolde set down the mug. She walked back to her room. She bolted the door. She sat on the bed with her hands in her lap, and she turned the word over in her mind the way she would have turned a blade, testing the weight, the balance, the edge. Love. She did not know what it meant. She did not know if she was capable of it. But the cook had said it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and the naturalness of it was the part that undid her. She also discovered, in the 2nd month, that she could laugh. This happened by accident. Osric was telling a story at breakfast, something about a horse that had escaped the stable and been found in the kitchen eating the cook's best bread. And the absurdity of the image struck something in her chest, and a sound came out of her mouth that she did not recognize. It was short, abrupt, more like a bark than a laugh. But it was a laugh, and the table around her went briefly quiet, and then Osric grinned, the first person at Ironvale besides the king who grinned at her, and said, "There she is!" There she is. As though there had always been a person inside the weapon, and the person was simply arriving late. She was learning Bramwell. He came every morning. He never missed. He knocked. He said her name. He asked. When she let him in, they sat by the fire and talked. And the talking grew longer and easier as the weeks passed, and the things they talked about grew larger. Not just the garden and the valley, but the past, the future, the world beyond the walls. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was young. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man but a fair one. He told her about the years of holding the territories together, the negotiations and the compromises, and the long, slow work of building something that did not rely on fear. And one night, in the deep of winter, when the fire was low and the snow was falling outside the window, and the silence between them had become comfortable, a warm, breathing silence, the silence of 2 people who did not need to fill the space with words. She told him about the compound. She told him about the knife when she was 8, about the training, about the first time she killed, and the sound of someone screaming the word "father" from across the field, about the cell with the door that locked from the outside, about the tears being a malfunction, and the anger being a malfunction, and the wolf being a malfunction, about Corvus's voice, quiet, measured, precise, explaining that she was not a person but a tool, and that tools do not choose and do not feel and do not break. She told him all of it in her flat, uninflected voice, and the flatness was not control anymore. It was the only way she could get the words out, the only way she could hold the story at enough distance to speak it without being destroyed by it. When she finished, the fire had gone out. The room was dark. The snow had stopped falling outside the window, and the world was very still. Bramwell had not moved. He had not interrupted. He had not flinched. Not once, not at any of it, not at the worst parts, not at the parts that made her own voice go thin and tight and nearly break. "You are not a weapon," he said in the dark. "You were never a weapon. You were a child who was taken and hurt and trained to believe that the hurt was purpose. But the hurt was not purpose. The hurt was violence. And you survived it, Isolde. Not because you are a tool, but because you are the strongest person I have ever met." She was crying. She knew it this time, recognized the wet heat on her face, the contraction in her chest, the shaking that was not cold and not fear, but the release of something that had been held for 15 years. She was crying, and it was a malfunction, and she did not care, because the king was in the dark with her, and he did not flinch. "May I hold you?" he asked. He asked. In the dark, with her face wet and her body shaking and her hands full of all the things she had done and all the things that had been done to her. He asked. "Yes," she said. His arms came around her. He was large and warm and solid, and he held her the way the wolf had pressed its forehead against her chest, with a weight that was both enormous and impossibly careful. She felt his heartbeat against her face, slow, steady, unflinching. She cried until she was empty. Then she stayed in his arms because the warmth was real and the steadiness was real, and the dark was not the dark of a cell with a door that locked from the outside, but the dark of a room where she was safe. Corvus came back at the end of winter. He did not come through the gate. He came at night with 20 wolves, through the eastern pass that should have been snowed shut but had been cleared. Someone inside Ironvale had cleared it, someone in the household who owed a debt or harbored a loyalty that the snow could not bury. Isolde heard them first. She was in her room, awake. She still slept lightly, still woke at the smallest sound, the training layered, too deep to dissolve in a single season. She heard the crunch of boots on snow in the eastern courtyard, a sound that was wrong because the eastern courtyard was closed at night and the boots were too many and too coordinated and moving in the particular rhythm of a military formation. She was out of bed and at the door before the second thought formed. She did not bolt the door behind her. She left it open because bolting it now would trap her, and a trapped weapon is a dead weapon. The thought came, and she did not correct it. In this moment, she was what Corvus had made her, and the thing he had made her was about to be used against him. She moved through the hold in darkness, silent, precise. The old training took over, the silent step, the awareness of space and distance and the weight of every shadow. She did not go to the king's chamber. She went to the eastern courtyard first because the threat came from the east, and you always face the threat before you face the thing you are protecting. She reached the courtyard wall and looked down. 20 wolves, dark cloaks, weapons drawn. They were moving in 2 columns, one toward the main keep, one toward the eastern wing where the king slept. At the head of the column, moving toward the keep, was a lean gray figure she would have recognized in any darkness, in any weather, in any lifetime. Corvus. He had come for 2 things. He had come to kill the king because the king had taken his weapon. And he had come for her because a weapon that turns on its maker must be broken or recovered, and Corvus Ashenmoor did not permit breakage. Isolde watched the column split. She had 30 seconds before the first column reached the eastern wing. She had perhaps 60 before the second reached the main hall. She was one person. She was one person against 20 armed wolves. But she was also the most dangerous weapon Corvus Ashenmoor had ever made. And she was about to demonstrate what that weapon could do when it chose its own target. She dropped from the courtyard wall into the shadow below. Her feet made no sound on the frozen ground. She moved along the base of the wall, behind the first column, and she reached the eastern wing door before they did. The guards at the door were dead. She found them in the snow, 2 men, throats cut, still warm. Someone inside had opened the door. The traitor. She stepped over the bodies and into the stairwell. Above her, she could hear the first column climbing. Heavy boots on stone, the clink of weapons, the controlled breathing of men who thought they were undetected. She was faster. She had always been faster. She took the servant's stair, the narrow one she had mapped on the first day of the summit, the one that ran parallel to the main staircase and opened onto the corridor outside the king's chamber. She reached the corridor first. The king's door was closed. The bolt was thrown from the inside. 2 guards should have been here. They were not. More traitors, or dead. She knocked. 2 raps, the way he always knocked on hers. "Bramwell, wake up, they are here." Silence. Then movement, fast, heavy, the movement of a man who slept lightly enough to wake at a knock and move immediately to action. The bolt scraped. The door opened. Bramwell stood in the doorway, dressed in trousers and a tunic, barefoot, his dark hazel eyes alert and sharp. "Corvus," she said. 20 wolves, 2 columns, 1 heading for the main hall, 1 for this wing. The stairwell guards are dead. He has someone inside." Bramwell did not flinch. Of course he did not flinch. He nodded once, sharp, and reached for the heavy iron sword mounted on the wall beside the door. "Osric is in the north wing," he said. "If the main hall column reaches him—" "I will handle the column in the stairwell," Isolde said. "You get to Osric, sound the alarm." He looked at her. In the dim corridor, his dark hazel eyes met her pale gray ones, and she saw the thing she always saw, the refusal to be afraid of her, the steadiness, the trust. But she also saw something else, concern, not for himself, for her. "There are 10 men in that stairwell," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I have beaten worse odds in the training yard at Ashenmoor with 1 hand bound." He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth move, a fractional lift, suppressed, the ghost of something that in a different moment would have been a grin. He reached out and touched her face, his rough palm against her cheek, brief and warm and full of something that she was only beginning to learn the name of. "Do not die," he said. "I am very difficult to kill," she said. "Corvus made sure of that." He went left, she went right, and the hold of Iron Veil woke to the sound of the alarm bell, and the night split open. She met the first column in the stairwell. 10 men, armed, moving in tactical formation up the narrow stone stairs. They expected resistance from guards. They did not expect Isolde. She fought in the old way, the Ashenmoor way, silent and fast and precise, every movement calculated, every strike designed for maximum effect with minimum exposure. She had 2 blades, the short knife from her boot and a longer blade she had taken from the dead guard at the eastern door. She used the stairwell itself as a weapon, the narrow space that forced the attackers into single file, the stone walls that limited their ability to flank, the low ceiling that prevented overhead strikes. She did not think about what she was doing. She thought about who she was doing it for. Every blade she turned, every man she dropped, every step she held. It was not the mechanical execution of a weapon performing its function. It was a choice. She chose to stand in this stairwell. She chose to protect the man who slept behind the door she had bolted. She chose, and the choosing made her faster and stronger and more dangerous than Corvus had ever imagined. Because a weapon that fights because it must is strong, but a person who fights because she chooses is something else entirely. She held the stairwell. She held it for 12 minutes, long enough for the alarm to spread, long enough for Osric and the household guard to reach the main hall, long enough for Bramwell to rally his wolves and drive the second column back through the gate. She held the stairwell until the last of the 10 men retreated, bloody and broken and stumbling down the stairs into the courtyard where the household guard was waiting. She sat down on the top step of the stairwell. Her hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, from the aftermath, the crash that follows violence, the body's delayed reaction to the chemicals of combat. She had cuts on her arms, and a bruise forming on her ribs, and a shallow wound on her left thigh that was bleeding steadily into the stone. She looked at her hands. They were bloody. They had always been bloody. But tonight the blood was different, because tonight she had chosen whose blood she spilled. Bramwell found her there. He came up the stairwell in the gray pre-dawn, his sword in his hand, his dark hair wet with sweat, a cut on his cheekbone that was bleeding into his beard. He saw her on the step. He saw the blood. He set down the sword and knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Minor," she said. "The thigh will need stitching." He looked at her thigh. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face, her pale gray eyes, her sharp jaw, her short-cropped hair damp with sweat and someone else's blood. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. "You held the stairwell," he said. "I chose to hold the stairwell." "I know," he said. "That is what I am saying." He picked her up. She did not resist. She was too tired to resist, and his arms were warm, and the shaking was getting worse, and the stairwell was cold and gray, and she did not want to sit on the stone anymore. He carried her through the corridor, past the chamber door that was still open and still bolted from the inside, and into the room where the fire had burned down to embers. He set her on the bed. He rebuilt the fire. He sent for the healer. Corvus was captured in the courtyard. Isolde learned this later, how the household guard had surrounded the remaining wolves, how Corvus had fought and been subdued, how he had been dragged to the holding cells beneath the keep with his hands bound and his gray face blank with the fury of a man who could not believe his weapon had turned. Dagna was with him. She had been part of the column. She had come because Corvus had ordered her, because 30 years of service did not dissolve in a single winter any more than 15 years of training did. But when the household guard came for Corvus, Dagna had set her weapon on the ground and knelt in the snow and put her hands behind her head without being asked. Isolde went to see her, 3 days after the attack, when her thigh was stitched and the bruise on her ribs was turning the color of a storm and the shaking had finally stopped. Dagna was in the holding cell, a small stone room with a cot and a bucket and a door that locked from the outside. The symmetry was not lost on either of them. "You look different," Dagna said. She was sitting on the cot, her iron gray hair still cropped close, her angled face older than Isolde remembered but the same, all edges and old scars and weariness. "I sleep in a bed now," Isolde said, "and I hold my knife wrong at meals." Dagna's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Dagna did not smile, had never smiled, had trained it out of herself the way she had trained it out of Isolde. But the twitch was close. "He does not flinch," Dagna said. "The king." "No," Isolde said, "he does not." "Good." Dagna looked at her hands. They were rough and scarred and still, the hands of a woman who had built a weapon and was now looking at what the weapon had become. "I am sorry, Isolde, for what I helped make you." "You also set my nose," Isolde said, "and sat with me when I was sick, and told me about my mother." "That does not. It does. It does not cancel the rest, but it is not nothing. You are the crack, Dagna, before the king, before the garden. You are the first crack in the wall." Dagna did not speak. She pressed her lips together and her eyes went bright, and she turned her face toward the stone wall and said nothing, and Isolde let the silence hold. Bramwell released Dagna a week later, not pardoned, released into the household, under watch, with the understanding that loyalty is not a debt, but a choice, and that the choice was being offered to her now. Dagna accepted. She took a position training the household guard, and she trained them differently than she had trained Isolde, with patience instead of punishment, with explanation instead of silence. She was not gentle. She would never be gentle. But she was less sharp, and the less sharp was a kind of progress. Corvus was held for judgment. The trial was set for the spring. Spring came to Ironvale, the way spring comes to a valley, slowly and then all at once. The snow receded, the garden woke, and Isolde stood in the south-facing bed where the chamomile would grow and felt the sun on her face and the warm earth beneath her knees and the astonishing, impossible fact that she was here, in this garden, in this hold, alive and unchained, and kneeling in the dirt because she chose to. The chamomile came up in late spring, small green shoots pushing through the dark earth, and then the flowers, white petals around golden centers, and they did look like small suns, just as Bramwell had said. She touched one. The petals were soft and slightly sticky and smelled of apples and honey. "You are smiling," Bramwell said. She touched her own face. He was right. The muscles around her mouth were doing something unfamiliar, pulling upward, changing the shape of her face, creating an expression she had not made in 15 years. It felt strange. It felt like a door opening from the inside. "I am smiling," she said, and the wonder in her voice was the most human sound she had ever made. Bramwell was watching her from the garden bench with his dark hazel eyes and his amber rings and his short dark beard and the particular expression he wore when he was feeling something large and choosing to contain it. He was not smiling, he's not yet, but his eyes were, and the eyes were enough. "There is something I want to tell you," he said, "and I want you to know that you can say no. You can say not yet. You can say never. The room stays yours. The bolt stays on the inside. Nothing changes." She sat back on her heels in the chamomile bed. The flowers swayed around her. The bees hummed. The garden was warm and alive and full of the soft chaos of things growing. "Tell me," she said. "The bond has been present since the garden," he said. "Since the morning you stood there with a knife at your hip and I asked you to choose something different. My wolf knew before I did. He recognized you immediately. The mate pull, the bond, the thing that goes deeper than choice because it is woven into the marrow. She was still. Not the old stillness, the trained stillness, the weapons stillness, the stillness of something calculating distance and angle. A new stillness, the stillness of a person listening to something important with her whole body. I did not tell you then because you were not ready. You had spent 23 years being told what to do and what to feel and what to be, and I was not going to add one more thing to the list of obligations you were carrying. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. But you are different now. You sleep in the bed. You hold the knife the right way. You smile at chamomile. His voice was rough. And I am asking you, not telling you, not ordering you, not deploying you, asking, will you bind with me? She looked at the chamomile. She looked at the garden wall, the wall she had once planned to climb on the way to killing him. She looked at the hold, rising pale and golden in the spring light, the windows full of sky. She looked at her hands, the hands that knew 37 ways to kill a man and were now covered in garden dirt and chamomile pollen. I do not know how to be a mate, she said. I do not know how to be soft. I sleep with a blade under my pillow, and I still catalog exits in every room I enter, and I flinch when people move too fast behind me. I know, he said. I am broken, Bramwell. Corvus broke me in ways I am still finding. You are not broken, you are scarred. There is a difference. Broken things do not work. Scarred things work differently. He stood. He crossed the garden to where she knelt in the chamomile. He extended his hand, open, palm up, empty, the same hand he had offered her in the garden on the morning she let go of the knife. She looked at his hand. She looked at her own, dirt-covered, calloused, the hands of a weapon that had learned to plant flowers. She took it. She took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of his palm was the same warmth it had always been, steady, unshakable, the warmth of a man who had looked at the most dangerous weapon in the Northern Territories and seen a person. Yes, she said, I will bind with you. He pulled her to her feet. She stood in front of him in the chamomile bed with garden dirt on her knees and pollen on her fingers and the sun on her face. He put his hands on either side of her face, his rough palms against her sharp jaw, and he looked at her with those dark, hazel, amber-ringed eyes, and he did not flinch. He had never flinched, not once, not in the garden, not in the dark, not in the stairwell, not now. He was the first person in her life who had looked at everything she was, the training, the killing, the cold, pale gray eyes that made wolves flatten their ears, and refused to be afraid. She kissed him. She did not know how. She had never kissed anyone, had never wanted to, had never been in a position to want. But she leaned forward and pressed her mouth against his, and his beard was rough, and his lips were warm, and his hands on her face were careful and strong, and the kiss was not a weapon, and not a tactic, and not a mission objective. It was a choice. Her choice. The first thing she had ever done that was entirely, completely, only hers. The binding was held on a morning in late spring, when the garden was in full bloom, and the chamomile flowers were everywhere, small white suns in the dark earth. Isolde wore a dress for the first time in her life. It was simple, dark gray wool, fitted with silver thread at the cuffs and a high collar that covered the scar on her throat. Dagna had helped her dress, standing behind her in the room with the bolt on the inside, fastening the clasps with hands that were rough and careful and shaking slightly. You look... Dagna stopped. She cleared her throat. You look like your mother. Isolde turned. She could not see her mother's face. She had no memory of it, no image, no description beyond the single fact that she had been an Omega in a border pack. But Dagna had known her. Dagna had been there when Corvus dissolved the pack and took the children. She was brave, Dagna said quietly. She stood between Corvus and the children. She did not have a weapon. She did not have a wolf. She stood there with nothing and did not flinch. She did not flinch, Isolde repeated. No, neither do you. They walked to the garden together. The hold was gathered, the household, the guard, Osric standing at the king's right, the stable master with his dog at his heel, the cook and the servers and the people who had given Isolde space at the table and taught her to hold her knife the right way and said good morning to her in the corridor until good morning became something she looked forward to hearing. Bramwell stood in the center of the garden beside the chamomile bed. He wore his dark wool coat, clean, the silver clasps polished, his dark hair neatly combed and the gray at his temples catching the light. His dark hazel eyes with their rings of warm amber found her the moment she entered the garden, and they stayed on her, steady, warm, unflinching, as she walked toward him. She walked the length of the garden. 40 paces. She counted them because she always counted paces, exits, distances, the dimensions of every room she entered. But this time the counting was not tactical. It was ceremonial. Each step was a step away from the compound and the cell and the door that locked from the outside. Each step was a step toward something she had not known she was allowed to want. She reached him. He took her hand. His palm was warm and rough and familiar, and she held on with the grip of a person who had spent her whole life being told she was not allowed to hold anything. The elder spoke the binding words. They were old words, older than the hold, older than the territories, old as the bond itself. Isolde listened to every one. She repeated her part when it came, and her voice was not flat. For the first time in her life, her voice had inflection, unsteady, rough, cracking on the edges, but inflection. The words had shape, the words had weight, the words were hers. When it was done, Bramwell leaned down and kissed her forehead. Not her mouth, her forehead, where the scar ran from temple to eyebrow, the scar that Dagna's blade had given her when she was 14. He pressed his lips against it and stayed there for a moment, and the gesture was so tender and so specific. Not the scar, not the training, not the weapon, but the girl who had survived the scar, that she closed her eyes and felt the last piece of the wall crack and fall. The garden erupted in sound, cheering, clapping, the dog barking, someone laughing. Isolde stood in the center of it with the king's hand in hers, and the chamomile flowers at her feet, and the spring sun on her face, and she felt the sound wash over her the way the sunlight did, warm and directionless and everywhere. That night, in the room that was theirs now, the room with the bolt on the inside, the fire in the hearth, the window that overlooked the garden, she lay beside him in the dark and listened to his breathing. Slow, steady, the breathing of a man who had never flinched. "Bramwell," she said. "Yes. I am not a weapon." She felt his arm tighten around her. She felt his breath in her hair. She felt his heartbeat against her back, strong and sure and constant. "No," he said. "You never were." She closed her eyes. The room was dark. The bolt was thrown. The garden was quiet outside the window, the chamomile flowers closing for the night, the bees sleeping in the eaves. And Isolde, who had been a blade, who had been a girl, who had been a weapon that chose its own target and a person who planted flowers, lay in the dark with the man who did not flinch and let the stillness hold her. And the stillness was not the stillness of a weapon waiting. It was the stillness of a person at rest. And outside in the dark, steady and patient, a wolf, the color of river mud, lifted its head toward the window where its mate slept. Its amber eyes glowed in the moonlight. It breathed in the night air, pine and snow and the faint sweetness of chamomile, and it settled its great head on its paws and kept watch. Not because it had been ordered to, not because it was afraid, because it chose to, because that was what you did for the person who made you stop flinching too. Because Isolde had not known it yet, had not felt it stir beneath the training, beneath the cold wall, beneath the 15 years of Corvus's voice, telling her that every part of herself was a malfunction. But there was a wolf inside her too, small, cautious, ice-pale fur and silver eyes that matched the gray of her human eyes. A wolf that had been hidden so deep and held so still for so long that Corvus had never found her. But Bramwell had. Not with force, not with commands, not with again and again and again. With patience, with chamomile tea, with a hand extended palm up and a voice that said her name like it meant something, and a pair of dark hazel eyes that never, not once, looked away. The wolf inside Isolde had opened her eyes on the morning in the garden when Isolde let go of the knife. She had lifted her head on the day Isolde put her hand on the great brown wolf's fur and felt safe for the first time. She had stood when Isolde held the stairwell, lending her speed and her instinct and the fierce protective fury that Corvus had tried to train out, and failed. And she had pressed forward, warm and alive and undeniable, when Isolde knelt in the chamomile flowers and said yes, she would emerge in time. Isolde could feel her, a warmth in the chest, a stirring in the marrow, a presence that was not quite thought and not quite instinct, but the place between. In time, when the trust was deep enough and the safety was real enough and the bolt on the inside of the door had become not a necessity but a habit, the wolf would surface, and Isolde would shift, and she would run through the valley with Bramwell's great brown wolf beside her, and the running would be the opposite of fleeing. It would be joy, pure and animal and uncontained. But that was the future. Tonight was enough. Tonight, with the bolt thrown and the fire warm and the king's heartbeat steady against her back, tonight was more than enough. Isolde slept, and for the first time since she was 8 years old, she dreamed. The dream was not a blade, and not a cell, and not the sound of again. The dream was a garden. The dream was chamomile flowers. The dream was a pair of amber eyes that did not flinch. The dream was a door, bolted from the inside, that she had chosen to open.